It was a quiet Tuesday morning in the sleepy little town of Brookfield, the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. The streets were lined with small, family-owned shops, their brightly painted signs creaking gently in the breeze. A few early risers strolled by with steaming cups of coffee in hand, exchanging polite nods with their neighbors. The air carried the faint scent of freshly baked bread from the bakery on Main Street, mingling with the earthy aroma of dew-kissed grass. In the middle of it all stood the Brookfield Public Library, a modest brick building with ivy climbing its weathered walls. Inside, Emily Harper moved quietly between the shelves, her hands gliding over the spines of books as she arranged them with care. She had been the head librarian for 3 years now, and though her role wasn't glamorous, she found comfort in the routine. Her hair was neatly tied into a bun, not a strand out of place, and her glasses perched perfectly on her nose. She wore a soft blue cardigan over a simple blouse, her attire as unassuming as the woman herself. Emily had always preferred to stay in the background, letting the stories within the books shine brighter than her own. But there was something about Emily Harper, something that no one in Brookfield could have guessed. Behind the calm demeanor, the soft-spoken voice, and the ever-present smile, she carried a secret that would have shocked the entire town. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound blending into the library's peaceful silence. Emily reached for a book, its cover worn from years of handling. She ran her fingers over the title thoughtfully before placing it back in its rightful spot. For a moment, she paused, gazing out of the large front windows as the sun peeked over the horizon, casting a warm glow across the rows of bookshelves. Most people who saw her would assume she was content with her quiet life. And in many ways, she was. She loved the library, with its towering shelves and endless stories waiting to be discovered. She loved the way children's faces lit up during story hour and the satisfaction of helping an eager reader find their next favorite book. But Emily wasn't always a librarian. Once, her life had been very different. It wasn't something she liked to talk about, and even if she had wanted to, she doubted anyone in Brookfield would believe her. After all, who would expect a mild-mannered librarian to have a past filled with anything but books and quiet contemplation? A faint smile played on her lips as she moved toward the circulation desk, tidying up stray papers and aligning the pens in a neat row. It was one of those little habits she couldn't help but keep, a remnant of the discipline ingrained in her years ago. Years that she had worked hard to leave behind. Outside, the sound of a car engine broke the morning stillness, followed by the chirp of birds settling into their favorite tree by the library entrance. The day was starting, just like any other. And yet, deep down, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. Brookfield was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, or at least, they thought they did. People prided themselves on being friendly and welcoming, though they also had a knack for quietly judging anything or anyone that didn't quite fit their expectations. Emily had learned that when she first arrived. People had been polite enough, but their questions had been pointed. Where did she come from? Why move to such a small town? Wasn't city life more exciting? She'd given them simple answers, ones that wouldn't invite more curiosity. I wanted a change of pace, she'd said with a polite smile. Something quieter. It wasn't a lie, exactly. But it wasn't the full truth either. The truth was, Emily had chosen Brookfield for its quiet anonymity. It was a place where she could blend in, where no one would ask too many questions, and where she could leave her past behind. At least, that was the plan. As she walked through the library, checking to make sure everything was in order before opening, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of nostalgia for the life she'd left behind. It wasn't regret, exactly, but more a bittersweet acknowledgement of how much had changed. Once upon a time, Emily Harper had been anything but unassuming. But that was a long time ago, and she had no intention of going back to that life. Still, there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when her old instincts would resurface. Like when she caught the faint sound of a door creaking open behind her, even though the library wasn't supposed to open for another 15 minutes. She turned her head slightly, her body tensing ever so slightly. It was barely noticeable, the kind of reaction most people wouldn't think twice about. But for Emily, it was second nature. Her grip tightened on the book in her hand as she listened for footsteps. A second later, she heard the familiar voice of Mr. Jenkins, the retired schoolteacher who often arrived early to return his books. "Morning, Miss Harper," he called out cheerfully. Emily relaxed, her smile returning as she greeted him. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins. You're here early again." "Couldn't sleep," he admitted with a chuckle. "Figured I'd get a head start on my reading." As they exchanged pleasantries, Emily's thoughts drifted for just a moment. She couldn't help but wonder what Mr. Jenkins or anyone else in Brookfield, for that matter, would think if they knew the truth about her. If they knew what she was capable of. But most days, she liked it this way, quiet, predictable, and safe. Because in a world where people often judged others by appearances, Emily Harper knew better than anyone that the surface never told the whole story. Emily often thought of herself as a chameleon in the world, blending seamlessly into her surroundings. Her job at the library, the soft-spoken way she interacted with people, and even the way she dressed all served one purpose, to make her invisible in plain sight. For the most part, it worked. The townspeople liked her well enough. They found her dependable, kind, and good with children during the library's weekly reading hour. Parents admired her patience, and elderly visitors often lingered to chat about the good old days while she stamped their books. But despite her friendly demeanor, Emily was careful to keep a polite distance. She never shared too much about herself, deflecting questions with practiced ease. "Oh, I'm not very exciting," she'd say with a small laugh. "I just like books and a quiet life." And in Brookfield, that was an acceptable answer. Brookfield's residents had their own lives to think about, children to raise, crops to harvest, and the occasional community event to organize. They didn't pry too deeply into Emily's past because, to them, she fit right into the town's fabric. Still, Emily sometimes caught the curious glances. Like when Mrs. Carmichael, the town's self-appointed gossip, would drop by the library under the pretense of returning a book and then try to dig into Emily's personal life. "So, dear," Mrs. Carmichael had said just last week, leaning over the counter with a too-sweet smile, "you've been here for 3 years now, haven't you? And not even a peep about a boyfriend or family. Surely someone as lovely as you must have someone special waiting for her." Emily had smiled warmly but kept her answer vague. "I have all the company I need right here," she'd replied, gesturing to the rows of bookshelves. Mrs. Carmichael had pursed her lips, clearly unsatisfied with the response. But Emily had quickly redirected the conversation, recommending a historical romance novel she knew the older woman would enjoy. Within minutes, Mrs. Carmichael had been too engrossed in the book summary to push further. Encounters like that were common enough. Emily handled them with grace, but they served as a reminder to stay vigilant. The less people knew about her, the better. Underscore 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 on. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, painting the library's walls with warm, golden light. Emily checked her watch and noted that it was almost time to unlock the doors. She glanced around one last time to make sure everything was in its place. The bookshelves stood tall and orderly, their contents meticulously arranged by genre and author. The reading tables were spotless, the chairs neatly pushed in. Even the children's corner, often a chaotic mess of crayons and picture books by the end of the day, was perfectly tidy. Satisfied, Emily moved toward the front door. As she reached for the key, her reflection in the glass caught her eye. For a moment, she paused. The woman staring back at her looked so ordinary. So harmless. And yet, Emily couldn't help but feel a pang of disbelief at how much she had changed over the years. If someone had told her 10 years ago that she'd one day be living in a small town, running a library, and living such a quiet, uneventful life, she would have laughed outright. Back then, her days had been anything but quiet. Her mind wandered briefly to memories she usually kept locked away. The long nights of training. The grueling discipline. The rush of adrenaline when she'd stepped into the ring, facing opponents twice her size. She shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside. That was another life, one she had left behind for a reason. Brookfield was her fresh start, a place where she could reinvent herself and leave all of that chaos behind. But sometimes, no matter how hard she tried, her past would find subtle ways to resurface. Underscore 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 on. The library opened its doors to a slow trickle of visitors. A young mother came in with her toddler, heading straight for the children's section. A high school student wandered over to the computers, likely working on a last-minute assignment. Emily greeted each person with her usual warmth, her smile never faltering. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," she said to the mother. "The new board books you asked about came in yesterday. Let me show you where they are." The mother beamed. "Thank you, Emily. You're always so helpful." Emily guided her to the children's section and spent a few moments chatting about early literacy programs before returning to the circulation desk. For the next hour, the morning passed peacefully. But as the clock neared noon, Emily felt a strange tension in the air. She couldn't quite place it, but her instincts, the ones she had trained to ignore in this new life, were suddenly on high alert. It started with the sound of heavy footsteps outside the library, louder and more forceful than usual. Emily glanced toward the window and saw a group of 4 men loitering near the entrance. They were dressed in leather jackets, their presence out of place in a town like Brookfield. One of them leaned against his motorcycle, the shiny chrome glinting in the sunlight. Another flicked a cigarette to the ground, crushing it under his boot. Emily's brow furrowed slightly, but she said nothing. It wasn't her place to judge who could or couldn't enter the library. Still, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her chest. The bell above the door jingled as the men entered. Their boots echoed loudly against the polished floor, shattering the library's usual tranquility. Emily looked up from the desk, her face calm and composed, though her senses were on high alert. The leader of the group, a burly man with a dragon tattoo snaking up his neck, sauntered toward her. His expression was one of amused disdain, as though he found the sight of the quiet library absurd. "Afternoon, ma'am," he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry through the entire building. Emily smiled politely. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" The man chuckled, glancing over his shoulder at his companions, who smirked in response. "Oh, we're just here to browse," he said, the word dripping with mockery. Behind him, one of the other men snickered. Another reached for a book on a nearby shelf, flipping it open carelessly before tossing it back without bothering to put it in its proper place. Emily's grip tightened ever so slightly on the pen she was holding, but her expression remained neutral. "You're welcome to browse," she said evenly. "But I'd appreciate it if you handled the books with care. Some of them are quite old and fragile." The leader raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by her response. "Is that so?" he said, stepping closer to the desk. "Well, we wouldn't want to break anything, would we?" The tension in the room was palpable now, though none of the other library patrons seemed to notice. Most of them were too engrossed in their own activities to pay attention to the newcomers. Emily, however, was paying very close attention. Her eyes flicked subtly to the exits, noting their positions and the paths she could take if things escalated. She also observed the men closely, the way they moved, the way they carried themselves. They didn't seem like the type to start a fight for no reason, but Emily knew better than to underestimate anyone. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. The leader smirked. "Oh, don't worry, sweetheart. We'll let you know if we need anything." With that, he turned and walked away, his companions following him as they wandered aimlessly through the library. Emily watched them for a moment before returning her attention to the circulation desk. Most days, she liked to think she could leave her past behind. But as she observed the men out of the corner of her eye, she couldn't help but wonder if today would be one of those days when her past refused to stay buried. When the clock struck noon, the Brookfield Public Library's serene atmosphere unraveled. The faint hum of turning pages and the occasional cough gave way to the unmistakable sound of heavy boots pounding against the polished floor. 4 men strode in, their presence dominating the room like a sudden storm cloud over a sunny day. They were clad in leather jackets adorned with patches, chains jangling at their sides, and boots scuffed from miles of rough roads. The leader walked at the front with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, his imposing figure drawing nervous glances from the few patrons scattered across the library. Emily Harper, seated at the circulation desk, didn't flinch. She barely even looked up. She had seen them before, mostly at the diner on the edge of town where they'd make a scene just loud enough to get attention but not bad enough to get kicked out. They were known for testing boundaries, pushing limits, and enjoying the reactions they got. The leader, a burly man with a dragon tattoo curling around his forearm, smirked as he reached the desk. His dark eyes scanned Emily like she was just another quiet face in a quiet town. "Hey, lady," he barked, slamming a book down on the desk with enough force to send a stack of neatly arranged papers flying. "Where's your little quiet zone now, huh?" The sharp slap of the book hitting the desk startled a few patrons. A mother in the children's section glanced over nervously, pulling her toddler closer. The high school student at the computer froze, his eyes darting toward the commotion before quickly returning to his screen. Behind the desk, Emily's hand paused mid-motion as she reached for a pen. Slowly, she straightened and adjusted her glasses, her expression as calm as the surface of a still pond. "This is a public library," she said evenly, her voice firm but quiet, like a blade hidden in velvet. "Please lower your voices." Her tone was polite, but there was an unmistakable authority behind it. The leader's grin widened as he leaned forward, resting his tattooed arm on the desk. He was close now, close enough that Emily could smell the faint mix of motor oil and cheap cologne clinging to him. "Or what?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "You'll shush me to death." Behind him, the others chuckled. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running across his cheek, grabbed a book off a nearby shelf. He flipped it open, pretending to read, before tossing it carelessly onto the floor. Another biker, younger and bulkier, reached for a globe displayed on a corner table. He gave it a hard spin, laughing as the continents blurred into a streak of colors. The fourth man, tall and silent, stood near the entrance, his arms crossed. He didn't join in the antics, but his sharp eyes scanned the room like he was assessing the situation or waiting for something. Emily's eyes flicked toward the fallen book, then back to the leader. Her hand clenched briefly before she forced it to relax, her fingers curling lightly around the edge of the desk. Years ago, she might have reacted differently. But Emily Harper wasn't the same person she used to be. "Please treat the books with respect," she said, her tone unyielding. "They're not yours to damage." The leader threw his head back and laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Listen to this one, boys. Respect the books," she says. "Like we came here to study or something." The others laughed harder, their voices echoing through the library. Emily didn't join in their amusement. She stayed perfectly still, her eyes steady and unreadable behind her glasses. "Is there something I can help you find?" she asked after a moment, her voice calm as ever. Or are you just here to disrupt others? The leader's grin faltered slightly, as though he hadn't expected her to hold her ground. But he recovered quickly, leaning closer. What if we are, he challenged. You gonna kick us out, librarian lady? Emily met his gaze without blinking. If you're disturbing other patrons, I'll have to ask you to leave. And if you refuse, I'll contact the authorities. At this, the laughter died down. One of the bikers whistled low, mock impressed. Oh, she's got some fire, huh? The leader's smirk returned, though there was a flicker of something colder in his eyes now. He straightened, taking a step back but not breaking eye contact. All right, sweetheart, he said, raising his hands as if in surrender. We'll play nice. For now. He turned to his companions. Come on, boys. Let's see if this place has anything worth our time. The group dispersed, their boots thudding against the floor as they wandered through the library. One of them knocked over a chair on purpose, snickering as it clattered to the ground. Another opened a magazine, ripping out a page before tossing it onto a nearby table. Emily's jaw tightened, but she didn't move from behind the desk. From her vantage point, she could see the mother in the children's section, her expression tense as she tried to keep her toddler distracted. The high school student had taken out his earbuds, clearly too anxious to concentrate on whatever he'd been working on. The library, once a haven of peace, now felt suffocating. Emily took a slow, measured breath. She knew she couldn't afford to escalate the situation. Not here, not now. But that didn't mean she would let them walk all over her. Underscore 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 on. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. The bikers showed no signs of leaving. If anything, they seemed to be getting bolder, their voices growing louder and their actions more disruptive. At one point, the wiry man with the scar approached the desk, holding up a torn page from a book. Hey, Miss Librarian, he said, waving the page like a flag. What's the fine for? Artistic adjustments. Emily's eyes flicked to the page, then back to him. Damaging library property is a serious offense, she said, her voice steady. If you continue, I'll have to report you. The man grinned, clearly enjoying himself. Oh, no. Don't report me. Anything but that. Behind him, the leader chuckled. Relax, Danny. She's just doing her job. There was a note of mockery in his tone, but there was also something else, something darker. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she made a mental note of their behavior, her mind calculating every detail, the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they seemed to thrive on pushing boundaries. She had dealt with people like them before. People who underestimated her. And if there was one thing Emily Harper knew, it was how to handle underestimation. For now, she let them think they had the upper hand. She let them believe she was just a meek librarian, powerless to stop them. Because if they pushed her too far, they would find out exactly how wrong they were. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time as the atmosphere in the library grew increasingly tense. The bikers didn't seem in any hurry to leave. Instead, they prowled the aisles like wolves, their laughter and crude remarks cutting through the usual stillness. The mother in the children's section eventually decided she'd had enough. Emily watched as she gathered her toddler into her arms, her movements hurried and anxious. The child whined softly, protesting the interruption of playtime, but the mother shushed him gently, throwing a nervous glance toward the gang as she made her way to the door. Emily felt a pang of frustration. The library was supposed to be a safe space for everyone, a sanctuary where people could escape the chaos of the outside world. Watching someone leave out of fear felt like a personal failure. She made a mental note to call the sheriff if things escalated further. But a part of her hesitated. Brookfield's law enforcement wasn't exactly swift or reliable. Sheriff Taylor was a good man, but his small team was overworked and more suited to handling lost pets than dealing with intimidating outsiders like these bikers. For now, Emily decided to keep an eye on them herself. The leader, who seemed to have taken an interest in making her uncomfortable, returned to the desk. He leaned casually against the counter, his grin as infuriatingly smug as before. "So," he drawled, "what's it like, working in a place like this?" "Must be boring." Emily didn't take the bait. "I enjoy my work," she said simply, her tone neutral. The man chuckled, clearly unsatisfied with her response. "Oh, come on. Don't you ever get tired of all these dusty old books? Don't you want a little excitement in your life?" Emily's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "Excitement is overrated," she replied. The leader's grin faltered slightly. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something else, but then one of his companions called out from across the room. "Hey, Rick. Check this out." The leader Rick straightened and sauntered over to see what the commotion was about. Emily watched as the group gathered near a display of local history books. One of them, the wiry man with the scar, had pulled out an old map of Brookfield and was holding it up like a trophy. "Look at this," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the library. "A treasure map or something. Bet the old librarian here knows where all the good stuff's hidden." The others laughed, their voices grating on Emily's nerves. She rose from her seat and walked over to them, her movements deliberate but calm. "That map is part of our historical collection," she said, her tone firm. "Please handle it with care." The scarred man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by her request. "What's the big deal? It's just an old piece of paper." "It's over 100 years old," Emily replied. "And it's not yours to destroy." For a moment, the man looked like he might argue. But then Rick stepped in, plucking the map from his hands and placing it back on the shelf with exaggerated care. "There," he said, smirking. "Happy now?" Emily didn't respond. She returned to the desk, her mind racing. Underscore 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 on. The tension in the library continued to build, each passing minute feeling heavier than the last. The bikers seemed to take pleasure in pushing boundaries, testing her patience with every move they made. One of them, the bulky younger man, started flipping through a magazine loudly, ripping out pages and crumpling them into balls. Another began stacking books precariously on a nearby table, laughing as the pile wobbled dangerously. Emily's jaw tightened, but she refused to let her frustration show. "Enough," she said finally, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The bikers paused, their eyes turning toward her. "This is a public space," she continued, her tone calm but unyielding. "You're welcome to stay if you respect the rules. If not, I'll have to ask you to leave." The room fell silent for a moment. Even the patrons who had been trying to ignore the commotion looked up, their expressions a mix of relief and apprehension. Rick tilted his head, studying her with a mix of amusement and curiosity. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But what makes you think you can tell us what to do?" Emily's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "Because I can," she said simply. The scarred man let out a sharp laugh. "Hear that, Rick? She thinks she's the boss of us." Rick's grin widened, but there was something darker in his expression now. "All right, librarian," he said, taking a step closer. "Show me how you're gonna make us leave." Emily didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, her gaze locked on his, her posture calm and controlled. The room seemed to hold its breath. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, a new sound broke the silence, a shrill, insistent beeping. Emily glanced down at the pager clipped to her waist, the small device vibrating against her hip. She frowned. The pager was a relic from her old life, something she kept out of habit more than necessity. It was linked to a private emergency line, one she hadn't used in years. The bikers noticed the sound too, their attention momentarily diverted. "What's that?" Rick asked, his tone suspicious. "Nothing that concerns you," Emily replied, silencing the pager with a quick press of a button. But inwardly, her mind was racing. Who could be trying to contact her now, after all this time? The pager beeped again, the sound louder this time. Emily sighed and reached for it, glancing at the small screen. The message was brief, just a single word: trouble. Emily's heart sank. It seemed her past wasn't as far behind her as she'd hoped. The gang's antics escalated, their laughter and crude comments filling the library with a tension so thick it felt like the air itself had grown heavier. They weren't just there to make noise anymore, they were testing boundaries, pushing limits, and waiting to see how far they could go before something, or someone, pushed back. Emily watched them carefully from behind her desk. Her mind was calm, calculating. Years of discipline had taught her how to remain composed under pressure, and now, those lessons were second nature. Her sharp eyes followed their movements, noting every detail: the wiry man's unpredictable energy, the bulkier one's habit of knocking over chairs as he passed, the silent one near the entrance who hadn't said much but seemed to be watching her more closely than the others. Then there was Rick, the leader. His confidence, loud and unshaken, made him the most dangerous of the group. He fed off the reactions of those around him, and his smirk grew wider each time one of his companions caused a scene. The wiry man, still lingering by the shelves, grabbed a hardcover book and tossed it across the room like it was a frisbee. It hit the ground with a loud thud, skidding across the polished floor. "What's the point of all these books anyway?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "None of this crap matters in the real world." Emily stood, her movements unhurried but purposeful. She stepped out from behind the desk, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she approached the man. "That book you just threw," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's a first edition. Worth more than that jacket you're wearing." The wiry man's sneer faltered, a flicker of uncertainty flashing in his eyes. For a moment, he looked like he might say something, but before he could respond, Rick let out another booming laugh. "Look at her trying to sound smart," Rick said, shaking his head. "You gonna fight us over some dumb book, sweetheart?" Emily tilted her head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Her demeanor hadn't changed, she was still composed, still calm. But there was something in her expression now, something subtle yet unmistakable. "Something like that," she replied, her tone light but laced with a quiet confidence that caught Rick off guard. For the first time, the library fell silent. The bikers exchanged glances, their laughter fading as they tried to gauge whether she was joking. "Is that so?" Rick said, stepping closer to her. He was towering now, his shadow casting long across the floor. "And just how do you plan to do that?" Emily didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, meeting his gaze with an unshakable calm. "I don't have to," she said finally, her voice as steady as a metronome. "But I will if you give me no other choice." Underscore 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 on. The tension in the room shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. For the first time, the bikers seemed unsure of themselves. The silent one near the entrance spoke for the first time. "Rick," he said quietly, his voice low and measured. Maybe we should head out. We've had our fun. Rick turned to him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he might listen. But then he shook his head, his smirk returning. "Nah," he said. "We're just getting started." He turned back to Emily. "All right, librarian," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Show me what you've got." Emily's gaze didn't waver. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she took a slow, measured step forward. "Leave," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Now." Rick's grin widened, but before he could respond, a loud crash echoed through the room. Everyone turned to see the bulky biker standing by a display case, its glass front shattered. Shards of glass littered the floor, glinting like broken stars in the harsh overhead light. "Oops," the man said, his voice thick with mock innocence. Emily's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "Enough," she said, her tone sharper this time. "You've caused enough damage. Leave, or I'll call the police." Rick raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And what are they gonna do, huh? Write us a ticket?" Emily didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly as she dialed. Rick frowned, his confidence faltering for the first time. Hey, no need for that," he said, holding up his hands. "We were just messing around." "Too late," Emily said, her voice colder now. She turned her back to him, lifting the phone to her ear. But as she waited for the call to connect, something unexpected happened. The silent biker, who had been watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression, stepped forward. "Rick," he said again, his tone firmer this time. "That's enough. Let's go." Rick turned to him, his frustration evident. "What's your deal, man? We're just having fun." "It's not fun anymore," the man replied. "We're done here." Rick looked like he might argue, but the other man's expression stopped him. After a tense moment, he let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine," he said, turning back to Emily. "We're leaving." "Happy?" Emily didn't respond. She simply watched as the bikers began to file out of the library, their boots thudding heavily against the floor. But as Rick reached the door, he paused, turning back to her. "This ain't over," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You'll regret this, librarian." Emily met his gaze, her expression unchanging. "We'll see," she said simply. And with that, he was gone. Underscore 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 on. The library was quiet again, but the air still crackled with residual tension. Emily stood in the center of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't let it show, she couldn't let it show. Slowly, she turned and began to pick up the pieces, her movements deliberate and steady. But as she worked, a single thought lingered in her mind. This wasn't over. She knew Rick's type. He wasn't the kind of man to back down easily. And the look in his eyes as he left told her that he would be back. Emily sighed, her fingers brushing against the pager clipped to her waist. She hadn't wanted to use it, not yet. But as she glanced down at the small device, she knew she didn't have a choice. Her past had caught up with her, and it was only a matter of time before she would have to face it. The library was eerily silent after the bikers left, their chaos lingering in the overturned chairs and scattered books. Emily adjusted her cardigan and surveyed the damage. Broken glass glittered beneath the soft light, a jagged reminder of the tension that had filled the space just moments ago. Her breathing slowed as she returned to the desk. Outwardly, she seemed calm, but inside, Her thoughts raced. She had avoided conflict for years, building a quiet life where she could bury her past. Yet, in just one afternoon, that peace had been disrupted. Emily knelt to pick up the torn pages from a magazine. Her hands moved methodically, but her mind was elsewhere, analyzing, preparing. She had spent years mastering her self-control, but she could still feel the faint hum of adrenaline coursing through her veins. The faint beep of her pager brought her back to the present. She unclipped it and glanced down. Another message. Prepare. The word was curt, a stark reminder of the life she had tried to leave behind. Emily sighed, placing the pager on the desk. She looked out at the library, now empty except for a few patrons who had hesitated to leave. A young woman approached, cradling a book to her chest. "Are you okay, Miss Harper?" she asked, her voice soft. Emily nodded, offering a small smile. "I'm fine, Lily." "Thank you." Lily hesitated, her gaze flickering to the broken glass. "That was intense. Should we call someone?" Emily shook her head. "No need. They're gone for now." The young woman didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the matter. Instead, she handed over the book to check out and whispered, "You're braver than I'd be." As Lily left, Emily's smile faded. Bravery had nothing to do with it. It was instinct, honed over years of training. Training she thought she'd never need to use again. The next day, the library reopened as usual, but Emily knew better than to assume the bikers were gone for good. People like Rick didn't just walk away, they came back, louder and more reckless than before. Emily spent the morning tidying up the damage from the previous day. The display case had been replaced with a temporary shelf, the books stacked in neat piles. To the casual observer, it was business as usual. But Emily wasn't just a librarian. She moved with quiet purpose, her eyes scanning the room for vulnerabilities. Exits were checked, locks tested. A faint buzz of muscle memory reminded her how to sweep a room, ensuring she could navigate it quickly if needed. She had lived this way before, years ago in a world far removed from Brookfield. But back then, she hadn't been shelving books. She had been dismantling threats, one calculated move at a time. Her mind returned to the pager and its cryptic messages. Someone out there still had her number, someone who knew what she was capable of. Emily retrieved her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Harper." The sound of her name made her stomach tighten. "It's me," she said. There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Didn't think I'd hear from you again." "I didn't think I'd call," Emily admitted. "But something's come up." "You're compromised." "Not yet," she said. "But it's heading that way. I need information." Emily's suspicions proved correct. 2 days later, Rick and his gang came back. This time, they didn't wait for subtlety. They roared into the parking lot, their motorcycles echoing through the small town like a thunderstorm. Patrons near the windows froze, their faces pale as they watched the gang dismount. Emily didn't need to look. She already knew who it was. Rick barged in first, the door slamming open with a force that rattled the glass. He strode into the library like he owned it, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the floor. "Miss me," he drawled, his grin as cocky as ever. Emily stepped out from behind the desk, her expression calm. "You're not welcome here." Rick chuckled, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "You think you can keep me out of a public library? That's cute." The other bikers fanned out behind him, their presence menacing. The patrons began to shuffle toward the exit, their movements hurried but quiet. Emily held her ground. She knew how this would go. They wanted her to back down, to retreat. But that wasn't an option anymore. Rick walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone almost conversational. You've got some nerve, talking to me like you did the other day. No one embarrasses me like that and gets away with it. Emily's gaze didn't waver. You embarrassed yourself. The room fell silent. Even the other bikers seemed taken aback by her boldness. Rick's grin vanished, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. You've got a big mouth for a librarian. And you've got a big ego for someone who doesn't know when to quit, Emily shot back. The tension in the room crackled like a live wire. Before Rick could respond, the silent biker stepped forward. Emily recognized him immediately, the one who had spoken up last time, urging the gang to leave. Rick, he said quietly, his voice steady. Let's go. Rick turned to him, his expression a mix of disbelief and irritation. What is with you, man? You've been acting weird ever since we got here. The man didn't back down. This isn't worth it. Let's go. Rick looked like he might argue, but the other man's expression stopped him. For the second time, Rick hesitated. Fine, he spat, turning back to Emily. But this isn't over. The gang filed out, their departure as loud as their arrival. But Emily knew they wouldn't stay gone for long. As the library doors swung shut, the silent biker lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting Emily's. There was something in his eyes, an unspoken message, a flicker of understanding. And then he was gone. Underscore 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 on. Emily stood alone in the quiet library, her thoughts swirling. She didn't know why the silent man had intervened, but she knew one thing for certain. The storm wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As the library doors swung shut behind the gang, a heavy silence settled over the room. The few patrons who had stayed froze in stunned disbelief, their eyes darting between Emily and the disheveled scene. For a moment, no one spoke. Emily adjusted her sleeves calmly, retrieving her glasses and slipping them back onto her nose. She moved toward the circulation desk as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but her heart was still pounding in her chest. She had broken her cardinal rule, never reveal. For years, she'd lived a quiet life, blending into the shadows, hiding the parts of herself that had once defined her. But today, she had no choice. Her muscles ached slightly, a reminder of the years that had passed since she'd last used her skills. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breathing. Then, she heard the slow clap. It came from the corner of the library, where the silent biker, the one who had tried to de-escalate the situation earlier, stood with a faint smile on his face. His leather jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, and his posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp. Well, he said, stepping forward. I can honestly say I didn't see that coming. Emily met his gaze, her expression unreadable. You should leave with the others. He shook his head. Not yet. I think you and I need to have a little chat. Emily's instincts kicked in. She took a subtle step back, her hand brushing against the edge of the desk. I don't know who you are, but I'm not interested in talking. The man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. Easy. I'm not here to fight. In fact, I might be the only one in this room who understands who you really are. Her eyes narrowed. And who do you think I am? He smiled faintly, leaning against the desk. You're not just a librarian. That much is obvious. The way you moved back there? That's training. Military, maybe. Or something even more specialized. Emily didn't answer, but her silence was telling. I thought so, he continued, his tone measured. I've seen people like you before. People who disappear from one life and try to build another. You did a good job, too. For a while, at least. Her fingers tightened against the desk's edge. What do you want? "I want to know why someone like you is working in a small town library," he said, his voice softening. "And I want to know what you're hiding." The question lingered in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Emily stared at him, her mind racing. She could deny everything, brush him off, and hope he left. But something about his presence, the calmness in his voice, the knowing look in his eyes, made her realize it wouldn't work. She took a deep breath. "I don't owe you an explanation." "No," he agreed. "But if those guys come back, I'd like to know who I'm dealing with." Emily hesitated, then glanced toward the nearest window. The sunlight streamed in, casting long shadows on the polished floor. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I used to work for an organization," she began. "Not military, but close. We handled situations, dangerous ones that couldn't be resolved through normal channels. I was skilled at what I did." The man listened, his expression neutral but attentive. "After a while, I couldn't do it anymore," Emily admitted. "I wanted a normal life. So I left. Cut ties with everyone, changed my name, and came here. I thought I could start over." "And the gang?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe they're just troublemakers. Or maybe someone found me." The man nodded slowly. "And if it's the latter?" Emily's gaze hardened. "Then I'll handle it." The next day, Emily arrived at the library early, as usual. The morning passed uneventfully, with the familiar hum of patrons browsing the shelves and the faint clatter of keys at the computer stations. But by mid-afternoon, trouble returned. The roar of motorcycles echoed through the streets again, louder this time. Emily's stomach sank as she recognized the sound. The gang was back. And this time, they brought reinforcements. A dozen bikers stormed into the library, their presence overwhelming the small space. Rick led the charge, his face twisted in rage. "You think you're tough," he sneered, pointing a finger at Emily. "Let's see how tough you are now." Emily stood behind the desk, her posture calm but her mind racing. This wasn't just a petty act of revenge. This was an escalation, a challenge she couldn't ignore. The silent biker who had introduced himself as Jake appeared at her side. "You're outnumbered," he murmured. "I've faced worse," Emily replied, her voice steady. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Good. Because I think you're about to." The first move came from Rick. He lunged toward the desk, his fist aimed at Emily. But she was faster. She sidestepped his attack, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. With a swift motion, she disarmed him, the knife he had been hiding clattering to the floor. The library erupted into chaos. Emily moved like a force of nature, her years of training coming back in a flood. Each motion was precise, efficient, and deliberate. She disarmed one biker, swept the legs out from another, and ducked just in time to avoid a chain swung toward her head. Jake joined the fight, proving he wasn't just an observer. He took down two bikers with surprising ease, his movements quick and calculated. The patrons who had been in the library scattered, some watching in awe from the safety of the windows. Rick, dazed but determined, scrambled to his feet. He grabbed a chair and swung it toward Emily, but she caught it mid-swing and shoved it back at him, knocking him off balance. "Enough," she shouted, her voice echoing through the room. The remaining bikers froze, their confidence shattered. Emily stood in the center of the library, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. Her cardigan was torn, her hair slightly disheveled, but her gaze was fierce. "Get out," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. One by one, the bikers retreated, dragging their wounded comrades with them. Rick was the last to leave, his expression a mix of anger and fear. "This isn't over," he growled. Emily stepped closer, her voice low but deadly. "Yes, it is. Don't come back." As the door slammed shut behind them, the library fell silent once more. Emily surveyed the room, taking in the overturned chairs and scattered books. Jake leaned against a shelf, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. "Not bad," he said, his tone almost amused. Emily shot him a look. "You didn't tell me you could fight." "You didn't ask," he replied with a shrug. She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite herself. The patrons began to filter back in, their expressions a mix of awe and curiosity. One elderly man approached her hesitantly. "Miss Harper," he said, "I never knew you had it in you." Emily adjusted her glasses, her demeanor calm once more. "I'm full of surprises," she said lightly. As the library settled back into its usual rhythm, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve. Her past had caught up with her, but she wasn't running anymore. Sometimes, the quietest people held the loudest secrets. And sometimes, those secrets were exactly what was needed. The library had returned to a semblance of calm, but Emily knew better than to believe it would last. Her instincts, honed over years of training, told her this wasn't the end. People like Rick didn't just back down, not when their pride was on the line. As she cleaned up the library, Emily caught Jake watching her from the corner of the room. He had stayed after the fight, offering to help repair the damage. There was something about him, an air of quiet understanding, like he recognized the weight she carried. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "are we going to talk about what just happened, or are we pretending this is normal for you?" Emily paused, placing a stack of books back on a shelf. "Depends. Do you usually walk into libraries expecting a full-blown brawl?" Jake chuckled softly, leaning against a nearby table. "Not exactly. But I've been around enough to know when someone's not who they appear to be." She sighed, meeting his gaze. "And who do you think I am?" Jake's expression turned serious. "Someone with a past. Someone who's been trained to handle herself in ways most people can't even imagine. Am I wrong?" Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "No, you're not." "Thought so," he said, crossing his arms. "But I have to ask, why here? Why a small-town library, of all places?" She glanced around the room, her eyes softening. "Because it's quiet. Because people don't ask questions. And because I thought I could leave that part of my life behind." Jake nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Well, for what it's worth, you handled yourself back there. But Rick? He's not the type to let this go." "I know," Emily admitted. "And I'm ready for him." The following morning, Emily arrived at the library early, as usual. But this time, she wasn't just preparing for another quiet day of shelving books. She was preparing for a confrontation. Jake had returned as well, claiming he wanted to see how things played out. Emily didn't argue. Having an ally, especially one who could hold his own in a fight, wasn't the worst idea. "I don't like waiting," Jake muttered, glancing out the window. Emily smirked. "Patience isn't your strong suit, is it?" "Not when I know trouble's coming." As if on cue, the roar of motorcycles echoed in the distance. Emily's expression hardened. "They're here." Jake straightened, his posture tense. "What's the plan?" Emily's eyes flicked to the library's layout, her mind mapping out every possible move. "We keep them contained. No one gets hurt unless it's absolutely necessary. And we make it clear that this is their last chance to leave." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And if they don't take the hint?" Her voice was cold and steady. "Then we finish it." The gang stormed into the library once again, but this time, they weren't just there to intimidate. They were out for revenge. Rick led the charge, flanked by a group of bikers who looked even meaner than the ones from before. "You thought you could humiliate me and get away with it?" Rick snarled, his voice dripping with rage. Emily stepped forward, her expression calm but unyielding. I gave you a chance to walk away. You should have taken it. Rick laughed, but there was no humor in it. Big words for a little librarian. Let's see if you can back them up. The fight broke out with a suddenness that took even Jake by surprise. Rick's gang spread out, knocking over tables and shelves as they tried to corner Emily and Jake. But Emily was ready. She moved like a shadow, her steps precise and deliberate. One biker lunged at her, but she ducked under his swing, delivering a sharp elbow to his ribs. Another tried to grab her from behind, but she twisted free, sweeping his legs out from under him. Jake, meanwhile, held his own against two bikers, using his speed and strength to keep them at bay. Not bad for a librarian's assistant, he quipped, grinning at Emily. This isn't the time for jokes, she shot back, dodging a chair that had been thrown her way. The fight was chaotic, but Emily and Jake worked together seamlessly, their movements complementing each other's. Slowly but surely, they began to turn the tide. Realizing his gang was losing, Rick grew desperate. He grabbed a metal chain from his belt and swung it wildly, forcing patrons and bystanders to scatter. You think you're better than me, he shouted, his voice raw with anger. You don't know who you're messing with. Emily faced him, her stance steady. You're right, I don't know you. But I know enough to see that you're scared. Rick's face twisted in fury. I'm not scared of you. With a roar, he charged at her, the chain whipping through the air. Emily sidestepped at the last moment, grabbing the chain and using Rick's momentum against him. He stumbled forward, crashing into a table. Before he could recover, Emily pinned him to the ground, her knee pressed firmly against his back. This is over, she said, her voice low but commanding. Call off your gang. Rick struggled, but he couldn't break free. You think this changes anything, he spat. Emily leaned closer, her gaze piercing. It changes everything. You're done terrorizing this town. And if you ever come back here, you'll regret it. Defeated and humiliated, Rick barked at his gang to retreat. One by one, the bikers filed out of the library, their bravado replaced with shame. Jake stood by the door, watching them leave. Think they'll stay gone? Emily adjusted her glasses, her expression calm but resolute. If they're smart, they will. Rick shot her one last glare as he limped out the door, his pride as battered as his body. When the library finally fell silent, the patrons who had been hiding emerged cautiously. They looked at Emily with a mixture of awe and gratitude. You saved us, one woman said, her voice trembling. Emily shook her head. I just did what needed to be done. As the sun set over Brookfield, the library stood as a symbol of resilience. The shelves were a little worse for wear, and a few chairs would need replacing, but the spirit of the place remained intact. Jake lingered by the door, his hands in his pockets. So, he said, what now? Emily smiled faintly. Now, I get back to work. He chuckled. You really are something else, you know that. She shrugged. Just a librarian. Jake shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. Not just. Never just. As he walked out into the fading light, Emily stood in the doorway, watching him go. She knew the peace wouldn't last forever, her past had a way of catching up with her. But for now, she was content. Sometimes, the quietest people held the loudest stories. And sometimes, those stories were worth fighting for. Word spread through Brookfield faster than a wildfire. By the next morning, Emily Harper wasn't just the quiet librarian anymore. The local coffee shop buzzed with conversations about her heroic stand against the gang. I heard she took out 3 of them with just her bare hands, someone exclaimed, their voice full of wonder. No, it was 4, another insisted. She threw one into a shelf, and the whole thing collapsed. The stories grew wilder with each retelling, but the truth was even more impressive to those who had witnessed it firsthand. At the library, a stream of visitors came not for books but for a glimpse of the woman who had stood her ground. Mrs. Henderson, of course, led the charge, bringing Emily a plate of cookies as a thank you. "You've got everyone talking, dear," she said with a sly smile. "You've become quite the hero." Emily chuckled softly, adjusting her glasses. "I'm just doing my job, Mrs. Henderson." But deep down, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of belonging. Meanwhile, Rick and his gang didn't get far. The commotion at the library had caught the attention of the local sheriff, who wasn't known for his leniency when it came to troublemakers. Sheriff Daniels pulled up behind the gang as they tried to leave town, his patrol car's lights flashing. Rick groaned, his head still pounding from his run-in with Emily. "License and registration," Daniels drawled as he approached Rick's bike. "What's the problem, Sheriff?" Rick asked, attempting a cocky grin. Daniels wasn't amused. "The problem is I just got a dozen calls about you tearing up my town and harassing folks at the library. You've got a lot of explaining to do." Rick's gangmates shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. One of them muttered, "It wasn't my idea." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "That's so? Well, I'll sort it out back at the station." By the time the gang rolled into the sheriff's office, their bravado had completely evaporated. Daniels made it clear, they were facing charges for vandalism, harassment, and disturbing the peace. "And let me make one thing very clear," Daniels said, leaning in close to Rick. "If you or your crew ever show your faces in Brookfield again, it won't just be me you'll have to deal with." "That librarian? She doesn't miss." Back at the library, the aftermath of the fight brought the community closer together. Volunteers showed up to help Emily clean and repair the damage. Even the kids from the high school chipped in, stacking books and straightening chairs. "You're kind of a big deal now, Miss Harper," said one of the teens, grinning as he hauled a box of books. Emily shook her head with a smile. "I'm just a librarian. But thank you for your help." Jake, who had become something of a fixture at the library since the fight, smirked from across the room. "You keep saying that, but no one believes you anymore." "Good," Emily replied, her tone teasing. "Let them think what they want. As long as the library stays quiet, I'm happy." The mayor even stopped by, offering his thanks and a promise to allocate funds for library repairs. "You've done this town proud, Emily," he said, shaking her hand. She nodded graciously, but inside, she hoped things would go back to normal. Back in the holding cell, Rick fumed. The fight had cost him more than just his pride, it had exposed his weaknesses. One of his gangmates leaned against the bars, shaking his head. "You should have just walked away, man. That librarian, she's something else." Rick glared at him but said nothing. He couldn't deny it, Emily had bested him in every way. When word of his defeat spread, the once feared leader of the gang became a laughingstock. Bars and biker hangouts refused to serve him, and his crew slowly started to drift away. For Rick, the memory of Emily's calm but deadly precision was a constant reminder of his humiliation. A few weeks later, the library was fully restored, looking better than ever. Emily returned to her routine, shelving books and helping patrons with their research. But now, there was a noticeable change in how people treated her. "Miss Harper, could you help me find a book on gardening?" a man asked, his voice full of respect. "Of course," Emily said, leading him to the right section. Every interaction was tinged with admiration and gratitude. People spoke to her as though she were a guardian of the town, not just its librarian. Jake, now a regular at the library, often teased her about her newfound fame. "You know, you could probably run for mayor at this point." Emily laughed. "And give up my quiet life here? Not a chance." But deep down, she appreciated the way the town had rallied around her. For the first time in years, she felt truly at home. As the sun set one evening, Emily locked up the library and stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cool evening air. The streets of Brookfield were peaceful, and the library's lights cast a warm glow onto the sidewalk. Jake appeared, his hands in his pockets. "Heading out?" "Just for a walk," Emily replied. He fell into step beside her. "You know, you never did tell me where you learned all that." She smiled faintly. "Some stories are better left untold." Jake chuckled. "Fair enough. But whatever your story is, I'm glad you ended up here." Emily looked around the quiet town, her heart full of gratitude. "So am I." As they walked into the night, the librarian and her unexpected ally, Brookfield, settled into its usual calm. But this time, there was an unspoken understanding. Beneath the quiet surface, strength and resilience thrived. And if trouble ever came knocking again, they knew exactly who to call. Emily's story became a symbol in Brookfield, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that strength often lay in unexpected places. People spoke of her with admiration, not just for her courage but for the grace with which she handled herself. In the end, the quiet librarian had taught the town a powerful lesson: sometimes, the strongest voice in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one that speaks through actions, not words. And for Emily, that was more than enough. In the days and weeks that followed the unforgettable library incident, life in Brookfield seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. The streets were as peaceful as ever, and the gentle hum of community life returned, punctuated by the occasional gossip about the librarian who could take down a bear. Emily Harper, though, stayed as she always was, calm, unassuming, and quietly brilliant. She returned to her daily rituals of cataloging books, organizing shelves, and helping patrons with the smallest of requests, never seeking any extra attention. For her, it wasn't about glory or recognition. But the town had changed. Brookfield now looked at Emily in a different light. She wasn't just that quiet librarian anymore, she had become a symbol of quiet strength, the kind that didn't demand applause or recognition but simply stood firm when the moment called for it. The kids who had once dismissed the library as boring now approached it with curiosity and respect. They whispered about the time Miss Harper stood up to the gang, and some even stayed to help her organize books or tidy up the reading area. Jake, the former troublemaker turned unlikely assistant, had taken a liking to hanging around after school hours. "You know," he said one day as he dusted off a row of encyclopedias, "you're kind of a legend now." Emily smiled, not looking up from the computer screen. "Legends are for fairy tales, Jake. I'm just a librarian." He grinned. "Yeah, right. A librarian who knows kung fu." The older patrons, too, seemed to hold Emily in higher regard. Where they once hurried past the circulation desk, now they lingered, sharing stories, asking for her recommendations, or simply marveling at the thought of what had happened. "I guess it's true what they say," Mrs. Henderson mused one afternoon as she borrowed a mystery novel. "Never judge a book by its cover." But Emily wasn't one to bask in attention. After the incident, she'd taken time to reflect, often retreating to the quiet of her small home at the edge of town. Late one evening, she sat by her fireplace with a cup of tea, gazing at the flickering flames. Her mind wandered back to the life she'd left behind, the years spent mastering martial arts in crowded dojos, the tournaments where she had faced opponents twice her size, and the discipline that had shaped her into who she was today. She hadn't chosen to keep her skills a secret because she was ashamed of them. No, she valued peace and quiet above all else. For Emily, the library had always been a sanctuary, a place where stories could unfold without chaos. But as she sipped her tea, she realized that perhaps her past and present weren't as disconnected as she thought. In the weeks following the fight, Emily noticed something remarkable: the community had grown stronger. The library wasn't just a place for books anymore, it had become a hub of connection and resilience. People who had never spoken to one another now exchanged smiles and greetings in the aisles. Parents brought their children, not just to read but to learn about respect, courage, and standing up for what's right. And Emily, ever the quiet observer, saw the change and felt a sense of pride not for herself, but for the town she had come to love. One day, Jake asked her, "Do you ever regret staying here, in this tiny town? You could have been, like, a famous martial artist or something." Emily shook her head, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "Not for a second, Jake. Sometimes the biggest impact you can make is in the smallest of places." As the seasons changed and the incident with the bikers became a distant memory, Brookfield found itself transformed in subtle ways. The residents walked with a little more confidence, knowing their quiet librarian had their back. And Emily? She continued her quiet work, her life filled with the rhythm of shelved books, typed catalog cards, and the occasional nod of respect from passers-by. Because true strength, she believed, didn't need to announce itself. It was in the everyday acts of kindness, the steady hand in moments of chaos, and the quiet resolve to stand firm when it mattered most. One evening, as Emily locked up the library, she paused for a moment, looking out at the tranquil street. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over Brookfield. She took a deep breath, feeling a quiet sense of contentment. The library was her world, and she had proven that even the smallest places could hold the greatest power. As she turned to leave, she thought of all the stories housed within the library's walls. Each one carried a message, a lesson, a spark of inspiration. And though she had always loved the written word, she knew her own story now lived beyond the pages. Sometimes, she thought, the quietest voices leave the loudest echoes. And with that, Emily Harper, the librarian who was anything but ordinary, walked into the night, ready for whatever the next chapter of life might bring.